Hello, everyone. All right, so I'm Vincent Fraley. I'm joined here with Lee Arnold. We're going to tell you a bit about the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So I'm sure that most of you have had a bad history teacher in the past. So very bad that when you hear the word history, your eyes begin to glaze over and you start picturing stuffy white men wearing wigs, writing things very boringly. But the story of the Historical Society is the story of public memory making in the city. As Jeff mentioned, the city trades very heavily on its past. From the thousands that queue up to see Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell, to the countless libraries, museums, historic sites that are scattered across the city. But this was not always the case. For nearly half a century after the Revolution, the majority of Philadelphians and the majority of Americans at large could not have cared less about their history. The institutions that today are dedicated to preserving the past that we take for granted were few and far between. Perhaps the best example of this is Independence Hall itself. In the decades after the Revolution, it was used for offices. There was no attempt to preserve it or to make it open to the public. So what is it that changed in the minds of Philadelphians to make the city's stories worth saving? For many across the country, this is actually a quote criticizing Philadelphians for their lack of a historical consciousness. For many across the country and here in Philadelphia, it was the return in 1824 of the Marquis de Lafayette, one of the few Frenchmen that most Americans know. At the time of his return, Lafayette represented one of the last few surviving founding fathers, one of the few last living links to the Revolution. Once he and his generation had passed, who or what would be around to tell the stories of the country's birth and how it's developed and how it's changed? Right. Lafayette's visit to Philadelphia animated, in particular, a group of 7 men here in Philadelphia that hailed from what we would today call the middle class. They weren't fancy white men in wigs. What began as a collection of 16 items in 1824, when they founded it the same year as Lafayette's tour, now numbers 21 million items. In these collections are the kaleidoscopic experiences of all Philadelphians, from the Swedes who arrived here way before William Penn and were living in holes dug out in the Delaware River's banks, to free African Americans living in the city in the antebellum period, to Japanese Americans interned during the Second World War, and to some of the earliest advocates of LGBT rights, which happened here in Philadelphia. I'm going to turn it over to Lee, who's going to tell you about a handful of those items.
Great. So I want to talk about what is a treasure. When I started at the Historical Society 24 years ago, it was not a question that was easily answered. The items that we now consider treasures at the Historical Society and the rest of it that lay in our aptly named treasures case were simply laying in loose folders and housed in different floors of the society. In fact, some of them weren't even in our building. When I was given the responsibility of administrating the manuscripts back in 1997, I decided to bring these items together so that they might be considered a treasure into one secure location. And my choice for treasures were basically dictated by my own OCD. I always thought, like, what would I be mortified if someone said, "What do you mean that was stolen? Why wasn't that in a secure case?" So I thought, what should I put in this secure case so that if in case it was ever a thief in the house? A historical treasure, in my mind, is an item that has direct, shared, substantial impact on our lives. Now, some of the slides you're hopefully seeing behind me reflect that. We have the 3 founding documents of our nation, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution. We have versions, early versions of all 3 of these. We also have the very first map of Philadelphia from 1682, a deed with the Lenni Lenape Indians, the death diary of George Washington, the only eyewitness account of his death, and the Underground Railroad Journal of William Still, and the first photograph in the United States.
Wow. Just those things.
Yeah, just to list a few. And actually, when I took over the manuscript department, as I said, these were all lying loose in folders, and I thought even the salad bar at Denny's has a sneeze guard on it, right? So I wrote a grant, and I got it funded. So between federal funding and private funding, we were able to have all of them stabilized and encased. But this brings me back to what is a treasure. Most of the items already mentioned reflect, as Vincent has aptly indicated, old white men. Now, as an old white man myself, I really don't take offense by this phrase, but really you think of it as an opportunity to redefine and expand the definition of what a treasure is. So we're not throwing out the Constitution, we're just adding more items into the drawers. So now our treasures case has expanded from a very rudimentary flat file slide. Yes, yes. That was Vincent's idea, by the way. Thank you. From a real sort of rudimentary case to a really high-tech two-sided case, and there's two sides with drawers on them. One side I call pride, the other one I call prejudice. So the pride side is where the traditional treasures have always been, you know, the constitutions, the maps, that sort of thing. And the prejudice side houses items which document how the items on the pride side have failed to live up to their original goals of equality and justice. So we have, for instance, the original speech of Dr. John Fryer, the psychiatrist who spoke in front of the American Psychiatric Association, held in Philly in 1972, which eventually got homosexuality delisted as a mental illness. We have the sketches of Sumiko Kobayashi, who as a young girl was interned in the Japanese-American camps during World War II. And we also have a map of what's called the walking purchase, which is where William Penn's sons swindled the Lenni Lenape for now a large chunk of what's now Bucks County. So in order to move for a better future, we have to acknowledge our imperfect past. And I was told that at these talks, you know, vulgarity is important, so I'm going to say darn, yeah, darn.